Previously, what we've discussed is how to shred RFPs and go through and identify all the requirements that you have to reply to. Now you sort through those requirements, and all of a sudden some things bubble up and you're just trying to figure out, how do I deal with this? And those are the types of things that we're talking about today. Once again, the 4 elements of a winning proposal from a CORTAC perspective. Compliance is number 1. We've had a webinar in the past on how to shred the RFP in order to understand where all the questions are, all the requirements. And once you have done that to the nth level, you will start to see that there are things that pop up that could become issues, and when you decide on a course of action, generally become a risk. And you want to be able to highlight all those things, characterize them, and present them to the capture team, and make sure that you've got a course of action that minimizes your risks and maximizes your probability of win. Where do we find these things? So I put together kind of a list here of the areas that I look for first, not completely, but first, for those things that could be real compliance challenges. We see a table here. We list RFP section on the left. We list some of the issues that we find, and we go through today's example on the right-hand side. We're not going to hit all of the things that we find, but we're going to try to highlight some examples, and some of these are really tricky as you go through them and are a conundrum for the proposal team to figure out how they're going to respond. We see things in statement of objectives. These are our top-level statement objectives that usually talk about what the overall goals of the government are. They talk about scope, roles, and responsibilities. And today we're going to talk about a data rights item that came out of a statement of objectives. The second area we look for is statement of work type things. These can set preconditions on the type of work that you've got to do. They can set conditions on the quality. They tell you the timing of the various things that have got to go on, and they also talk in detail about the roles and responsibilities, who does what, and what the interface between those organizations are, what the customer does versus the contractor, etc. Here we're going to be talking about earned value measurement and the requirement from the statement of work that said you had to have one of these systems in place. Another good place to look for compliance challenges is Section H. Here we find unique clauses. They could be agency unique, or they could be RFP unique. By agency, we mean the acquisition organization that has actually floated the RFP, and we'll be talking about a unique case there. In Section L, we have 2 parts of Section L that we normally can look for. The critical one is the solicitation provisions. There we start talking about facility clearance levels that you have to have, if any CMMI rating requirement is there, how to handle GFX, what any limitations on funding, all sorts of interesting stuff there that could be construed, and indeed many cases is specifically identified as a mandatory requirement. Today we'll be talking about government furnished material, in particular RFP. The second part of Section L is the PPI, the proposal preparation instructions, where most of that we're familiar with, right? That drives contents, the volume structure, what the topics are. They talk about format and whether or not B sizes are allowed, et cetera, et cetera. They talk about delivery. Is it electronic, paper, or a combination of both? Do you deliver them to other organizations or just internally? They define the outline. They talk about security limitations. Are you allowed to submit classified information or not? Today we're going to be talking about missing topics, and there will be a classic missing topic in this particular case because it was actually a topic where a volume was looking for something that was supposed to appear in another volume and it wasn't there. Finally, we'll talk about Section M, where you find the evaluation factors for award, and here we're looking for inconsistencies with Section L, and in particular we're looking for whether or not the requirements whether or not the criteria are rated requirements or pass-fail. And so we're going to be talking about a pass-fail criteria that was very critical that we had to meet. So like I've said, let's go into the statement of objectives. The statement of objectives is typically where you might find things like the government's objectives about data rights. Here we have a specific example going back a while where the Future Combat Systems, a joint Army-DARPA RFP was released about 15 years ago. The objective of this was to achieve the Army Objective Force capabilities. And specifically in there, they were looking for a lead systems integrator as the prime contractor. Now, FCS was a unique kind of acquisition in that it fell under something called the Other Transactions for Prototype 845. If you go in and research the prototype transactions for Prototype 845, you'll see that the contractor, the winning contractor, has to provide financial or in-kind cost share that basically requires the contractor to pop up $1 for every $2 that the government provides. This could be dollars, you're expanding the scope, or it could be that you're providing hardware, software, or whatever that you place a value upon. Now, in this RFP, in addition to the fact that it was an 845, they contained specific data rights. I quoted it there. The government wanted, now the government required government purpose rights, or GPR, on all intellectual property, including patents and data developed under this agreement. So we find that that was up in the SUE section of the RFP, but later on when we looked in the back of the RFP, we found that the evaluation criteria added a degree of ambiguity to this. They said that they were going to negotiate business issues such as intellectual property rights and any other issues with the model agreement. So you have this conundrum now. You are trying to figure out what you got to do to meet the requirements and whether or not you would be compliant. First of all, the company financial in-kind investment requires some kind of investment. It's either here is this hardware software that we place value in it, or we're actually going to put dollars against the contract in the form of independent research and development, bid and proposal, or profit, depending on what your disclosure statement is. You have to come up with that kind of investment in order to win this competition. Now, what that means, though, is if you do that, any dollars you spend on the contract, you got to give government purpose rights, where normally the contractor retains those rights on any IRAD, B&P, or profit. We're all used to marking proposals proprietary because they were company money that we generated that product, and then we retained rights over that, and specifically controlled, specific controls are put on proposals that are submitted to the government. On our future combat systems, which was a huge program and was going to roll out for years, there's many capabilities that the winning contractor is going to have to get. This would involve teammates, subcontractors, and vendors, which are typically the source of those technologies that you need to execute the contract. The companies, they want to protect their own intellectual property because, after all, that's the secret sauce that allows them to make money. So now, another conundrum was the Army wanted to share all this data across the entire contractor team. So that means that any participant on the contract can take that data and go sell it to another part of the government as long as it's specifically a government contract. Here you are faced with this conundrum, and you got to turn around and sell this to your management and the team on how you're going to do this. So what are the potential things that you can do? Okay, the first one is you follow the evaluation criteria lead. You look at that, it allows you some wiggle room. You specifically state that, consistent with that section M, we maintain that the data is ours until we negotiate it away. And we all provide a letter to that effect. I go to my teammates, I go to my subcontractors, I go to my vendors, and I get a letter that we're willing to negotiate this with the government. Now, the government's likely position in that case is a requirement takes precedence. Indeed, if you go to the tanker protest with the GAO back in 2007, 2008, one of the things that the GAO specifically cited was one of the contractors had taken an exception to the contract. They didn't take an exception, they just didn't meet it, and they were allowed to win, which was not allowed by the GAO. That was a specific exception. Another alternative that you can do is you can sit there and say, hey, we're going to follow those PPI instructions at the prime level only. Prime contractor says, anything we do, we will give up. However, the teammate subcontractors and vendors retain theirs. The likely government position in that respect would be, hey, the flow down of requirements is required. After all, that's what the prime contractor generally does, is those specific requirements that have to be flowed down should be flowed down, and the government's position likely could be that the requirements flow down is required. Or the third alternative, and of course this represents a range of alternatives, there's things in between here, but at one extreme you could follow all the proposal preparation instructions at all levels. You give up the IPR, your intellectual property with government purpose rights, you get all the teammates offered a choice. You either get on board, because after we win, we're going to be the only game in town, or go someplace else. The likely government position in that case is the offer is compliant with the RFP. And notice you could even write in there that, well, such and such a company won't get on board now, but once we win the contract, we can get them on board because we will be the only game in town. This is all a range of solutions that you could go for. Each one of these, you could decide that this is what we're going to adopt. Proposal professional, though, has got to be clear on what is the risk associated with each one of these positions. As we see, it could be that we had decided on a course of action that would lead us to being dropped during the competitive range. Not a good idea. Here's the second one in the list. This is one we find in the statement of work. Here we talk about earned value measurement systems. In this particular case, we have a program called the Armored Multipurpose Vehicle, a very recent procurement where the Army wanted to build replacements for 5 different variants of the armored personnel carrier, the M113. There was a CPIF contract for the EMD phase, as well as fixed price incentive LRIP options. Therefore, this is a fairly big procurement covering many, many years. The solicitation statement of work had specific requirements for EVMS. You found them right in there, and they applied to every single phase of the program. Had to be formally reviewed and determined by the DCMA to be in compliance with the guidelines of the ANSI 748. Not only that, but you must schedule an integrated baseline review, an IBR, to demonstrate that your program is on track with a full resource-loaded IMS, Integrated Master Schedule, 100 days after contract award. The final thing is fairly standard statement in most RFPs that they can reject if it's in the government's best interest. And then they give you a list of examples of why they may reject any proposal. And of course, one of them is proposes exceptions to attachments, exhibit, enclosures, or other solicitation terms and conditions. So that sits there and sets up the background. The challenge in this, you are faced with 2 main tasks here. First, you have to make sure that your EVMS system has the required certifications. And as we know, some companies have a habit of falling out and then going back in, and depending on where you are on that cycle, you could be in a program audit right now that could sit there and have significant negative findings that could impact your ability to win this contract. The second thing you have to do is you got to build and start running on a comprehensive program plan. The ANSI requires that you typically have a 6-month rolling wave with planning packages out beyond that. In this particular case, though, you've got to have an IBR at month 3, so you're already 3 months into the contract, and when you stand up to that IBR, you've got to have a 6-month rolling wave out from that point. So you really need to have a 9-month program plan worked out in the beginning so that you can start operating it. The offer needs approval for each of the operating units, right? So if you have a far-flung enterprise with multiple supporting units that are helping you, each one of them is going to have a DCMA finding as to whether or not your EVMS system is approved. If you have subcontractors, and these got to be major subcontractors, you may have to flow down that requirement. So you have to make sure that the DCMA reviews the prime and subcontractors and make sure that everything is coordinated across. And of course, this will take time because you're interfacing with multiple government offices to try to get these approvals. The IBR requires that you demonstrate you're operating to your plan. So you have to have building and operating the plan will require time. You have to have the plan there. And so what you really want to do is have it at the very beginning of the contract. And the reason is that you need at least 2 months to operating on the plan. You have 1 month to collect costs and schedule data, 1 month to process the reports, and then share the results. Given that that requires 2 months, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket if you decide to sit there and start the planning effort in the very beginning of the contract, which is also one of the most busiest times. What are your potential solutions? Hey, we're going to worry about that at contract award. Here's our plan to get the DCMA approvals. We had a good start, and we plan to finish by IBR. Basically, you're walking in with a promise. And any time the government looks at something that's basically a promise with no substantiation, no backup, whatever, they view that as having high proposal risk. First of all, you're dependent on an external organization to get the approvals, and then you have the risk of completing and then running on the program plan in order to meet the IBR requirement of 100 days. This would be viewed as high proposal risk if your position was we'll wait until contract award, which is a tendency after all, because we don't want to spend our hard-earned B&P dollars on something that, quote, should be a contract task. The second approach you can take is we have all the approvals. The past, we ran into some problems. Here's our corrective answer. The DCMA letter acknowledges it, but the government still comes back and says your proposal has moderate risk. Why? Well, because you haven't got the plan, but they will want to take you forward so that they can monitor your progress against the plan during the course of the evaluations when you get into discussions. The first, they may just reject you out of hand. This one, they say, let's keep these guys on through the competitive range determination, then we can find out if they're operating to their plan, and we can adjust their evaluation based on how well they're getting those DCMA approvals and how well they've got a program plan that is executable. The third option is you got all the approvals and here's the detailed plan. So once again, we have this range from, well, I'm not going to do very much to I'm going to do the entire thing. You got your detailed plan. You're ready on contract day one. The proposal is probably viewed as being very low risk. So once again, you have a range of alternatives here. Adopting one or somewhere in between is going to result in the residual risk that the proposal team has got to characterize for management so that they understand exactly what they're buying into and what the impact is to PWin. Agency unique requirements. This was interesting in that the government had an engineering and demilitarization of munitions contract where they wanted to get rid of all these old munitions in a safe and efficient manner. They had set up an award where they were going to give 3 IDIQ contracts. They asked for quality assurance surveillance plans so that they can evaluate how well you operated on the basic contract and use that to determine whether or not you were going to get any of the 4-year or 1-year options, 4 1-year options. And of course, that would also feed into your CPARs. The unique clause here, which was unique to this agency, was that this contract does not allow for the application of fee on support cost items. It was further clarified in L where they said no subcontractor fee shall be in any of their proposals, and you can read the exact text right there. The challenge is the contract requires the prime to get some outside help, and typically you might have to get that help from 2 sources. First of all, the folks that made the weapons that you're going to demilitarize, you may have to get some design information, or you might have to get something out of them, which may require that you work with government agencies or subcontractors who made those units. And then, of course, there were small business requirements that set minimum subcontracts. The total fee is set by the prime at award. All subcontractors need to bid 0 fee, and then the prime will distribute their share or fee to the subcontractors. This effectively reduces the fee on the total contract. If you had a $10 million contract and you gave half the fee to your subcontractors, you're going to report to management that basically your net return on this was 5%. Clearly not something you really want to go tell your management. The performance on the contract also determines option awards. If you have unhappy subcontractors, will they actually perform to par? Will they meet their contract requirements? Will they meet their deadlines? They could hold you hostage for fee. And you have unhappy customers in return who look at your performance and then say, maybe you don't get the option. And if you were counting on winning all 4 options to make your objectives, you could be cut short by this kind of a feedback based on what the customer's satisfaction would be. So what can you do? You can follow your own company policy on subcontractor fee. You take exception to the requirement, and you tell them it's not a really good idea that you don't reward people who are doing the best service. The government's likely position there is, hey, our policy trumps yours. You're likely dropped at the competitive range. Subcontractors bid normal, but you adjust the fee and proposal. So all these subcontractors come in with a fee value, and then you go in and zero out that fee when you roll up that cost into your prime proposal. The likely government position is your bid has high proposal risk. Why? Because you really haven't negotiated the leading the fee out of those subcontractors. Will they really sign up to that? Will they sign up to the fee that you anticipate giving them? So there's a certain amount of uncertainty with your bid, which the government translates to proposal risk. You could sit there and say, hey, we're going to do exactly what you asked for. Note the subcontractors have 0 fee. We deliver the full value of the cost provided in our proposal, which is what the government wanted. and the government's likely position is that it's compliant. Of course, you don't make a lot of money, but you have to convince your management that this is the sure, safe way as opposed to the others, which potentially could have some disastrous effects. Section L. This is an interesting one that illustrates the complexity at any time you use government-furnished materials. Materials could be anything that the government owns that you need to use. In this particular case, it goes back to the National Missile Defense Alternate Boost Vehicle, where the government wanted to buy a backup to the ground-based missile defense system. The contract called for development and flight test of 10 boosters, where they wanted to quickly protect CONUS by getting 10 in the hole in 5 years. There was also options for production and deployment of 55 boosters. These are big things. These are on the class of a Minuteman ICBM in terms of size, and so this is clearly a fairly large contract that you would like to get into. Section L contained the requirements for GFP. There were 3 citations in there that we found. You submit an itemized list, the description of the items to use, and the cost charged by the government. Identify the contracts and agreements under which each item was furnished or acquired, and the offer's proposal will be predicated upon the cost the cognizant government agencies will charge to provide the equipment. So they tell you first you got to give them all the data, then you got to show them the agreements that sits there and say that, yep, that government agency committed to give us this stuff, and then, oh, by the way, the government's going to add that cost, any cost that comes with that GFE, to your contract. 3 things. The challenge. First of all, you got to go get 2 different types of approval. First of all, you got facilities and non-expended items. These you need to get a rent-free, non-interference type agreement with the organization that gives it to you. The uses of each facility and the item, schedule, and duration, and that's got to be approved by the government and owning agency. The second item is expended items. So if you plan to use something that will be used up in the course of the contract and not returned to the government, then you'll have to have some value to the owning agency. The top one we got rent-free. The cost was rent-free, the cost was 0. Here, the government may want some kind of cost back for that product that you used. The challenge of obtaining these materials from outside agencies is that typically they have no vested interest in the success of your effort, unless it allows them some sort of advantage, like unloading old inventory. They do have an interest in obtaining as much as they can, so if you want something from them that's going to be used up as part of the contract, that estimated cost may be higher than what you anticipated. And all of this data must be available prior to your cost proposal preparation, right? Because if we have a price to win number that we got to hit, we got to fold in the cost of the GFE within that price to win. Therefore, we need to know how much that is, as well as the schedule implications on my program plan, which will also impact my schedule. So what do? Here's our list. You figure it out, Mr. Government. The offer's position is basically let the government fight this fight, right? Government, you got a vested interest. You'll force submission on those other guys in the government because you're the government. Basically, the government's position could be, most likely, is your bid is not compliant. You could be dropped to the competitive range, or the best case is they go off and find out the cost of those things and add it to your bid, a cost that you have no control over, you haven't negotiated, you haven't discussed, you haven't traded and given the opportunity to do all those things with that agency. So whatever cost that agency comes up with is the one that your customer is going to add to your cost. You got all the approvals, but some of those prices that the other government agencies gave us was a little bit outrageous. And we know we can do a lot better. You can help us. The likely government position there is we don't want to take the risk. We've added the agency cost to your bid and then evaluated that price. The third level, which of course once again illustrates the extreme, is we have all the approvals and everything is included. The position is it's fully compliant. It took us a while. And of course the likely government position is that we consider your GFX is now low risk. The key thing there is that you had to get everything done, which requires a lot of work up front and making sure that you've got everything that you need before you start developing all your costs and schedule data. Missing topics. Here's one where the Army had an armored security vehicle reset, basically repair and refurbish of about 784 vehicles. Section L defined 4 volumes. The standard reps and certs, which we normally call the contracts volume, past performance, cost price, and small business. In section M, under the past performance, they said it was going to be evaluated based consistent with the design, and that was the text that they actually used as it relates to the offeror's proposed solution. So now you have a case where the section M for past performance is going to look at the proposed solution, and if your past performance is consistent with your proposal, they're going to give you credit for it. The RFP does not require any design description. There is no provision for mission capability or technical volume. How can they do the job without it? Any submission of unsolicited materials may be rejected. As the contracting officer reviews the proposal upon submission, they're going to look and see if everything that they asked for is available and that there is nothing in excess of what they asked for is included. Why? Because if they allow something from one offeror that wasn't asked for, they risk unequal treatment of the various other offers. Another thing that was found in the tanker protest years ago. Unequal treatment of a competitor is considered bad form and was grounds for rejecting the proposal or rejecting a bid. Any submission that is allowed may not be reviewed. If you hide it someplace, like under a tab at the back of the volume, how do the evaluators know where to go find something? There are time limits. In other words, the evaluators are under a guideline to read, review, score, and get out. If they do not know where to go look for something, they don't have time to go through the entire proposal to go look for something. So this is a case where sometimes those evaluation teams don't communicate. The past performance evaluation team is usually a standing organization within each of the major acquisition agencies. Air Force, Army, Navy, they have groups that just evaluate past performance. They're pros at it. They have access to all the past performance information. They're used to it. Unfortunately, that team is usually separate from the system program office team that is evaluating the other parts, cost, etc. So those folks, we have an example here where the past performance team, an independent team, was expecting something to appear in another part of the proposal, and it wasn't. What do? You need to fix these types of problems prior to final RFP release. We like to ask questions in a very positive fashion. We like to, there's a quote right there in regards to the section M where it states, you're looking for this material, where should the offer put the material necessary to complete this important evaluation? When we do ask questions, we use a format that has 4 parts: quotes, questions or comments, recommendation, and rationale. We quote specific parts of the RFP where the problem is. We then construct comments or questions the way the customer asked them, and then we provide a recommendation. And this is specifically what we want to see, and only what we want to see. We use strikeout and underline text to show them exactly what we want them to do, and then the rationale is always written, why is this in your best interest, Mr. Customer? At the final RFP, you're on your own. You can make it an attachment or an appendix, but you run the risk that it won't be found. You can make it a standalone volume appendix. You can call it that. You run the risk that it could be rejected. In both cases, you're running a significant risk. This is why you get things fixed early. Here's the Section M pass-fail criteria. The Air Force Enhanced Polar System Control and Planning segment, EPS TAPS, was a firm price basic contract with 2 priced options. Basically, the scope covered everything from design through contractor support. The solicitation included specific requirements for small business, including Section L, where they said provide the type of work to whom, when, and how you plan to manage those subcontracts. The evaluation criteria addressed the small business as quoted. The proposal requirement will be met when the offeror, A, is one of the criteria, provides an effective small business participation plan as measured against total contract value that meets or exceeds the small business requirement. Notice this reads as pass-fail. You either meet the requirement or you don't. Notice that it doesn't say how well you meet the requirement. It says you meet it or you don't. So if you do meet the requirement, you have an opportunity for a strength, but you don't get any credit if you don't. Small business participation is a percentage of the total contract value. So now you have to find a lot of small businesses because it's total contract value. If it was subcontract value, then it would be different. And the small business type of work is part of the valuation. So if you can convince them that you got technically complex work going to your small businesses, you could get a strength. If you failure to meet the requirement, it could be an elimination. Because if something is unacceptable, does not meet requirement, the proposal is unawardable according to the section M. You must believe that all the candidates to do the technically complex work. You've got contract performances at stake as well as future awards. So what are your potential solutions? Do your best and see where it gets you. Okay, one of the things you could do is, it's really not possible to do at this time, but we promise to do our best, in which case the government likely position is you do not meet requirements. The factor is scored red and therefore is unawardable. You do your best and then define a plan to meet the goal, right? So you say, right now at this point, I've got small business participation. And when I get out to the future, especially when I get into the support phase of the program, I plan to bring on additional small businesses because that's best suited for that type of work. The problem there is, what is the risk of achieving your goals in the future is moderate. You have to sit there and give them the track record of expanding the small business participation. If you don't got that track record, how can they determine on your promise? An empty promise is usually viewed as risky. Then you could meet the small business requirement from day one. You can not only meet the goal, but we got the track record, and here's how we categorize the various classes of technical work. And you show that, gee whiz, a significant fraction of the subcontracted work to small businesses is technically complex. In that case, you meet requirement with a strength. So what are the conclusions that we come out of this? You got to shred the RFP and the attachments. Find all those requirements. And as we've illustrated, you'll find some of these tricky requirements in various parts of the RFP outside of Section L and Section M. You got to flag the compliance challenges early. A lot of these things require a lot of work to resolve. And if you go with a fully compliant approach, many times this is a huge amount of work. You got to get these during the draft RFP development. If you cannot do the work, then get them to tone back the requirement. Identify the range of potential responses. It is your job to sit there and do this. You got to say, here are the levels that we can respond to. And then you got to characterize the risk associated with each response. You're the proposal professional. You can go off and get help from other proposal professionals. The ones I like in this particular case are retired government contracting officers, because they will tell you what is the likely government response, which is the risk you're looking at. Then you decide on the course of action. You carry the associated risk, which is a risk against your P-win, and then you document the decision and disseminate to the team, right? You want to be consistent across all volumes. If this is our story, then that's what we're sticking with. And then I like to discuss this during the color team review in briefs. The reason why I'm doing this is I'm asking the color teams to assess how well we met our objective of trying to comply with this requirement. Did we meet the level that we wanted to? Have we adequately covered the risk? And what is the likely assessment of the evaluation when we go through it? So those are the things in conclusion. I'd like to thank you for your time. Once again, my name is Jim Helsper. My email is right there, jameshelsper@cortacgroup.com. If you have any questions that go beyond this, please feel free to give me an email. And with that, Joe, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Right now we have two questions, and I'll go ahead and ask them. I don't think you need to jump to the slide for either of these. The first one's actually about data rights. It was from slide 6. And a question came from David in Florida. Open system architecture is just becoming more prevalent in proposals. Do you envision the government customer becoming less tolerant in trying to negotiate data rights? And that's specifically for the defense sector.
Absolutely, and when I think the government is going to get more stringent on data rights. This was a change that happened about 15 years ago. More and more of the procurements coming out have demanded government purpose rights or full rights. They've been very careful, and remember, you've got two different things. You've got data rights and associated with intellectual property, and then you've also got licensing rights associated with software. They're two different things, and you have to deal with both of them. They're both very complex. One of the largest volumes I submitted ever was a data rights where we listed all the things that we took exceptions to. In other words, here's the things we reserve rights for. Why? The government wanted to know the charge numbers associated with the IRAD, B&P, or profit account that said this is where we did it on our own company dollar. And then the software associated with it. I mean, imagine trying to keep Windows in license forever. In some of these government systems, that's what they want. So data rights is a huge issue. It's one of the issues I always look for to check off, because it involves so many organizations within your client that it's unbelievable to get the data rights resolved.
All right, the next question comes from Ray in Florida, and this is a question about small business participation, and it's a question I've talked a little bit about pass-fail, but it's about small business percentages. Obviously, the government generally doesn't meet their small business percentages in the aggregate. Do you think that there's going to be more emphasis placed on small business percentages and by type, like 8A, women-owned, breaking it down into percentages like that?
Always. Small business, the small business organization within the federal government is a standalone little organization, right? And they've got their axe to grind, quite rightly, by the way, because small business is the engine that drives innovation in the United States. So they place a lot of emphasis on that, and they always have. So you're always going to have to be careful. Things are changing in the small business because for a while the government went through a program where they asked the contractors at a company level to write their small business plans, a comprehensive plan. And if you had a small business comprehensive plan, you know, that stood in for a detailed plan that went with the contract. And the government has moved away from the comprehensive plans. As a matter of fact, left some companies in a lurch because that's what they were counting on. So I think the small business is going to be here to stay. Will the percentages get more aggressive? I don't think so. I think there'll be a big push to get the meet the percentages overall. In other words, where they're not meeting it now, there's going to be more pressure for the program offices to try to sit there and push the primes into getting more and more small business participation.
And here's a follow-on question actually to that. Do you have to identify if a small business grows out of its size due to the contract award, such as an 8A?
Very interesting. Remember that a small business in itself, 8As and all that other stuff are different, but a small business in of itself is I forget the word, self-certified, I guess is the word. You basically say, I meet the requirements. All the other ones, small disadvantage, women-owned, veteran-owned, disabled veteran, those all have to be certified by the Small Business Administration. So they keep careful track, and that is one thing that the small business has to consider when they sit there and get into a large contract. Yes, you can turn from a small business into a big business sometimes on these contracts, in which case could run you into trouble. It's interesting that the stated objective of the Small Business Administration sometimes can be a penalty to grow into it, but that's the way it is.
And that's it. I don't see any other questions coming in. Thanks, everybody, again. I will get out the entire proposal training series. The next one is on February 25th, and it will be called The Path to Blue. And I hope everybody has a great day. And thank you for joining the CORTAC for our Proposal Compliance Challenges webinar. So long.
Thank you.